Can I remind members, visitors and those in the public gallery to please ensure their mobile phones are switched off or in flight mode for the duration of the meeting, as they interfere with the broadcasting equipment even when on silent mode. I would like to welcome from the Irish Congress of Trade Unions Dr Peter Rigney, Industrial Officer, and Dr Laura Bambrick, Social Policy and Legislative Officer, to the first session of our meeting today to discuss Ireland's skill needs. In accordance with procedure, I am required to read the following. By virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. If you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter, and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person or persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I would remind our guests that the presentation should be no more than 10 minutes duration. Members have been circulated with the presentation submitted by today's attendees. I now ask Dr Rigney to make the presentation to the committee. Thank you.
Look, members, Congress very much welcomes this opportunity to address the committee on the subject of what we think the linked matters of work permits and apprenticeship. What links these issues is how skills are formed in an economy. Do we make them or do we buy them in? There are provisions for work permits in both the high skill and low skill sectors of the economy, but it is in the latter that the controversy most often arises. There has to be a balance between a desire by some employers to recruit additional skills and a desire by other employers to depress wages. As a memo for an interdepartmental group states, quote, where employees on work permits are working for relatively low rates of pay, this will tend to set rates and conditions for other workers in the same occupations and sectors. According to the Central Statistics Office, the Q1 vacancy rate in this country this year was 1.1%, up from 0.5% in 2011, but still far below rates prevailing in mainland Europe, where the highest job vacancy rates prevail in the second quarter of 2018 were recorded in the Czech Republic 5.4%, Belgium 3.5%, the Netherlands 3.1% and Germany 2.9%. Eurostat recorded this country as having a stable job vacancy rate. So there may be skill shortages in selected areas. We're a long way from labour shortages. The Skills and Labour Market Research Unit of Solace, who, as far as we're concerned, would be pretty much the gold standard in terms of research in this area. In their 2017 bulletin report as follows on shortages. While shortages exist for a number of occupations across all sectors of the economy, many of these are small in magnitude and in particular niche areas requiring a number of years' experience. So that's a key thing to bear in mind. While there may be, for example, a shortage of engineers, it won't necessarily be filled by people just out of UCD or Trinity or Bolton Street. It's engineers plus experience, and indeed the shortage of engineers is pretty much worldwide. There are still 240,000 people on the live register and 17 million unemployed in EU 27. The latter are reachable through the EURE service, but employers make insufficient use of this service. The Job Path programme is aimed at Irish residents who are long-term unemployed, and government has paid more than €100 million in the past 2 years to two Job Path contractors, CTEC and Taurus New, who operate north and south of the line from Dublin to Galway. Bringing in a large number of non-EEA nationals on wages at or just above the minimum wage goes totally counter to the objective of this programme. We need to examine pathways towards regularisation for people who are perhaps here irregularly. A large number of people have come to this country on student visas to learn English. Some have overstayed their visas and have remained in the country illegally. A programme has recently been introduced, opening a path to regularisation. We need to evaluate the operation of this programme, take some time to look at it and see what happens, and maybe look how it's worked and look at possibly other targeted regularisation programmes. One possible criteria might be used is the possession of a QQI certificate in a work-related discipline. So you have the strange situation where somebody might be in the country illegally as far as one arm of the state, that's GNIB, is concerned, but has gone through the system and has a QQI certificate from the point of view of another arm of the state. So there may be a potential for a regularisation path there. To summarise on the question of work permits, we need to learn from mistakes and make policy on the basis of calm evaluation, not of news bites. This committee has a good track record in this area. A little less than a year ago, your committee published a report on the operation of atypical schemes in the fishing sector, describing the harrowing tales of exploitation it had heard in the course of its work. And the same mistakes must not be repeated in other sectors. Moving on to apprenticeships, the development of new apprenticeships has been underpinned by a broad level of consensus among the various players. The most recent statistical update was given to the Dáil on the week beginning the 25th of October. That, in fact, is outdated because I believe there were some questions last week. The Solas website lists 41 current apprenticeships. Of these, over a third, 14, are of the new generation of apprenticeships, and there are a further 11 apprenticeships in development and a longer list in pre-development stage. Apprenticeships were traditionally set at level 6, but of the newer generation of apprenticeships, 7 of the 14 are at level 7, that's ordinary degree, or 8 honours degree. One example for your consideration is the Industrial Engineering Apprenticeship run in Limerick Institute of Technology. This programme seeks to address the shortage of electrical engineers at level 7 or 8 by providing a pathway for existing electricians at level 6 to upgrade to level 7. The attraction for the apprentices is an opportunity for in-career progression, while for the sponsoring companies, the attraction is the opportunity to grow their own engineering talent with people they know and who have a proven record in the company. New apprenticeship sectors have developed in biopharma, in property service, in ICT, in finance and in logistics. In addition, new apprenticeships have been developed in electrical and mechanical. New apprenticeships as a percentage of the total apprenticeship registration have grown from 2% in 2016 to 10% in 2018. This will lead to a greater number of women apprentices. In the process of recruitment for apprentices, and I've been involved in this for over a decade, everything revolves around the CAO dates, particularly the date of offers. It is anticipated, however, that the concept of earn while you learn will catch on among young people. It is hoped that the expansion of apprenticeships will help address the problem of dropout rates and completion rates which exist in some parts of the third level sector. Returning to the question of skills, people will seek to enter occupations which have good wages and progression rates. They will tolerate low wages while learning in order to have long-term access to knowledge and skills. People will not remain in low-wage, low-prospect occupations. People want a career and not a job. DBEI recognises this when they stated in an internal document that some of the labour supply issues in certain industries will be alleviated if not resolved by the passing of the Banded Hours legislation. It is perplexing, and I'm always perplexed to see certain employers describing difficulties in recruitment in certain sectors and almost in the same breath stating that work permits in these sectors should have pay rates pitched at more than minimum the wage. So, in summary, work permits and apprenticeship are linked. They're linked to the proposition, do we buy in skills or do we make them ourselves? In relation to work permits, we have to be very cautious, bringing in people outside the EU 28 or 27, call it what you will, because the department here takes the view that one of its duties in work permits is to protect the Irish labour market, but you're really talking about the labour market of the EU 27. In relation to apprenticeships, the apprenticeship system has been recast and remodelled. There is a whole tranche of new apprenticeships there. The numbers involved are small, but the percentages are growing. Like any experiment, some aspects of the new apprenticeship may falter, but that's an argument for more evaluation and more support rather than for knocking the new system. So, Gormahagud.
Gormahagud, Dr. Rigney. I'll now invite questions. So, Senator Humphreys, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a short, sweet and to the point. Peter, just in relation to the work permits, and certainly I'm starting to see it being used to depress salaries and wages, and I'll ask your opinion in relation to the pilot scheme in relation to the work permits is pretty much targeted towards the meat industry. There was 800 up to the 10th, the 5th to the 10th this year. I think nearly 500 have been issued, and therefore mainly boners for €22,000 a year, €10 35. Now, there's a couple of concerns I have in relation to that. They're currently advertising on national websites for the same jobs, but are putting in the criteria that they will accommodation and language skills. But there's no clear indication in relation to those positions. Who pays for the language skills courses and the accommodation? Do you just get a link to daft.ie for somebody coming in from Brazil or whatever? And then the problem in relation to it is that how you enforce it. But the visa is tied to the employer. So in many ways I look at that as an indentured servant, because if I complain, I lose my job, therefore I lose my visa. So I think we're developing a problem, and especially we're developing a problem in rural Ireland where people want to see reasonably paid jobs. Like the boning industry in the meat factory is actually a quite skillful job. It's also physically onerous. And you probably have a short period of time. Yet by using the salary of 22,000 for it, it's not allowing people to access those jobs because they keep them at a very low minimum wage. And I'm just wondering, what's the Congress experience? Have they any experience of the pilot scheme initially and the overall effect of where the visa is tied to the employer? Does that lead to poor conditions of employment in the long term?
And just to add to that, because you did reference the fact that we looked at the non-migrant fishers from the EEA last year, and one of the recommendations we did make that the permit shouldn't be tied to the actual position. The permit should go with the worker, and it was one of the recommendations we made. We haven't had any action on that, but it was a clear recommendation of this committee last year.
But in the pilot scheme that was just launched, the permit is still tied to the employer. To the employer,
yeah, and it makes it very, very difficult if you're not happy in your role and you want to move on. Dr. Regan, if you'd like to comment
on that issue.
On that issue, you can.
Just about what reforms would you like to support or introduce on the work permit system? What specific reforms do you think we should bring?
Well, I'll answer the question in two parts. Firstly, by way of if you like, an allegory, there was a very powerful piece of television came on the 6 o'clock news, roughly the time that Romania and Bulgaria acceded to the EU, and the International Transport Workers Federation, which is a multinational trade union body, stopped a ship down in Dublin port for non-payment of wages and arrested the ship and got money off the ship owner. And Ingrid Miley did a lovely piece, a nice Christmassy piece for the 6 o'clock news, of all these Romanians smiling and waving €50 notes. The interesting thing was that the Ukrainians stayed on the ship because they were outside the EU. So if people have rights and know they have rights, they will feel free to exercise them. If people feel that there's a possibility that their permission to remain in the country and their permission to do emigrants' remittances, and God knows we in Ireland should understand emigrants' remittances, if they feel that they will, that is in some way conditional, they'll tend to keep quiet about it. So we would be very concerned about that. The other thing we would talk about this figure of 22,000. Normally, if the state sets a wage, it does so in a way that involves an emanation of the state. It does so by way of the Low Pay Commission, it does so by way of the Labour Court, it does so by way of the Scheme of Conciliation and Arbitration for Public Servants. So there is a process. In this process, a person or a group of persons in DBEI decided that this would be the wage. And we think that in the setting of rates for work permits, there is a role for the industrial relations machinery of the state, be it the Labour Court or be it the Low Pay Commission, so people can come in and make their pitch. I know, in fact, and having made an FOI request, that 22,000 is in fact higher than the minimum wage, and Meat Industry Ireland, according to stuff we received under FOI, wanted it capped at the minimum wage, and the department said no, and they made it higher at 22,000, and to that extent we would welcome it, even grudgingly. But the requirement for accommodation and language training is an addition and is an add-on, and is to be policed by the department and the WRC, as I understand it, and I have had no information about how that policing has worked to date.
Well,
sorry, just
on that point is in relation I follow that up. Yeah. They will only investigate on foot of the complaint.
Yeah.
And has clearly come back both groups have said they will only investigate on foot of a complaint. But if your visa is tied to your employer, you're not going to complain. Well,
I think to use the analogy, I mean, the guards don't work on the basis that they only breathalyse people on the grounds that somebody rings up in a pub and says so-and-so's unfit to drive. And
are you saying that when the job is advertised, it gives the wage, and it also says that there will be accommodation and English languages provided?
Yeah. And then they don't have wage? No. Well, there's no clarity in relation to that.
Well, sorry, if they did, they would be in breach of the work permit conditions.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've forgotten your question. I beg your pardon.
What reforms would you introduce to the work permit system? Particular reforms or reforms? The work permit system is particularly complex, and every time a problem is hit, they decide, well, we'll go from 43 permits to 44 permits to 45 permits. So it's very difficult to, and it's a piece of legislation that is updated 2 or 3 times a year by statutory instrument. And you know yourself the problems of reading statutory instruments, because it says in paragraph 43, delete a and put in there. So actually reading is quite... The main thing we would say is clarity in relation to the setting of wages. Clarity in relation to the setting of wages. That, as I say, there is a role for the industrial relations machinery of the state in setting of wages. Certainty in relation to language, because we are a migrating out country. We keep, and it's true. But I remember doing Irish for the Leaving Cert, and 2 of the textbooks were about migrants. One was Rocky Moore and Thale, and one was Deal and Jory. And both of these guys worked in England and America and Canada. They could all read a sign. They could all dispute their wages with the foreman. We don't tend to understand what it's like for people to come in here speaking Russian or Brazilian and not having a clue. So I think an emphasis on language learning paid for by the employer is and in many ways, some enlightened employers in the food sector who have long-standing Eastern Europeans, EEA members, are actually paying now for language learning, because, as I say, we have people who are 10 years who are very good at the actual job, and we'd love to promote them to supervisory positions, but they simply don't have enough English to be able to do it properly. So they're now providing those sort of skills. And language is a key thing in understanding the host society and being able to assert your rights in the host society.
Your comments are interesting, because it was another one of our recommendations that there would be a translator provided when we dealt with the migrant fishers as well. Yeah. That when there was an inspection on the vessel, if somebody comes on and they don't have the language that the person who's in distress has, well, they can't articulate the issues. So it was another of our recommendations that whenever they were being questioned, obviously there would have to be a translator there for them. Deputy Quinlivan, are you finished? I know you have to leave early. Have you any more questions?
Just questions on apprenticeships. I welcome your comments there earlier on, where you recognise the dropout rates in third levels, where people are going to courses they're probably not suited for, and that apprenticeships should now be considered a valuable piece of work, or for valuable work project process for people. So just on that, would you consider a CAO type application for apprenticeships, whereby people, in the past you had to kind of know somebody before you got your apprenticeship, or if you didn't know the person, you didn't get an apprenticeship, or it weren't advertised or whatever. And the two real questions I have for you is, what involvement have the trade unions had in the development of apprenticeships so far, and do you think you've been involved enough? And that's my question, basically. Sorry.
Well, sorry, nobody from the trade union movement will ever say they've been involved enough. That's a general thing. Sorry. We're involved. We have 2 members on the National Apprenticeship Council, which operates in Solace. In relation to the CEO, the strength of the apprenticeship system is that there can be no underfilling, because it requires an employer to say, I want a person. So in theory, if, the national need for stonemasons is 20 per year, there has to be 20 stonemason contractors who say, I want somebody. So, no, we wouldn't favour a thing, because there has to be a face-to-face interface between the employer and the young person to say, to interview them and estimate that they're suitable. Now, in order to combat things running in families, etc., etc.,
There are and there have been bursaries for women apprentices, for example, for quite some time in Falls. I think everyone would agree they haven't been hugely successful. But I think no to a CAO involvement. Because then you just anonymise it, and you get, the trouble is, I mean, if you look at what happens, and I want to be careful here giving the comments of the Chair, but if you're looking at the quoted position of the President of Universities Ireland, who has said that some universities game the system by slicing and dicing their courses into so small to inflate the courses. So, you know, the CAO is basically an auction. And the strength of the apprenticeship is there is a contract of an apprenticeship between the employer and the young person. But, I will rarely quote an employer, but on the apprenticeship committee, one of the IBEC reps said, if this new system will work, it has to be sold to the mammies of Ireland. You know, coming around to October, November, December of 5th year, what am I going to do? Because, you know, I remember going to college in the first year, and the first thing that was said to me was, you're not at school anymore. I don't care if you turn up to lectures. I don't care if you do your essays. You just won't pass. But you're adults now, and you're responsible for your own learning. I was okay with that. Other people weren't, and other people kind of fall through the system. Whereas if somebody is turned up on Monday morning and said, right, you're in the job now. These are the tasks. You'll get paid on Friday, and come 3 or 6 months down the time, you will go to an ETB training centre or to an IT, but they regard themselves first and foremost as an employee of the company, subject to the normal requirements of company life. If somebody makes a reasonable request to go and do something, you'll do it.
Deputy Kelleher, is your comment in relation to the reply, or is it a new question?
It's a new question, a very thought-provoking question.
Okay.
But I'm happy to wait.
Okay, Senator McLaughlin, please.
Yeah, at the end of your presentation, Dr. Rigney, you challenged the employers in terms of the pay rates. So I wanted to just develop that a wee bit further. Would you have evidence, anecdotal or better than that, in terms of companies that would try to utilise work permits to keep wages low rather than engage with their existing workforce? So I just want to get a better understanding. Would like to have evidence of that, have experience of that, have concerns about that, maybe to develop the point you made at the end. That's the first question. And then the second question then is in relation to the issue of apprenticeships. In the submission from the IDA, they point to the need for a greater level of integration with the further and higher education sector. They use the word alignment and integration. Maybe you could talk to us more about that. I mean, you did touch on that in your presentation, but do you feel that the institutes, technology, the universities are appropriately aligned? And obviously in your presentation you talked about the importance for the apprentice to, while they're serving their apprenticeship, to graduate through the various stages of academia and learning. So I just want to get a wee bit more detail from you on that.
Okay, in terms of employers and specific wage rates, we have no direct information as of yet from trade unions on what is happening, beyond whispers, and whispers are really only rumours and not worthy of being repeated. If it becomes more, if those whispers substantiate themselves, we'll take it to another place, to the enforcement arm of the state. I would have to say, that there are plenty of employers who want to pay good wages and who want to give decent conditions to their employees and are happy to develop learning paths for their employees. So to scale. In relation to, well, I haven't seen the IDA submission, and I'm not sure what's meant by alignment. I think the apprenticeships that have been there are delivered, traditional level 6 apprenticeships are delivered in a mix by the ETBs, basically in the old FOSS training centres. And whatever the bad reputation FOSS had, it certainly wasn't drawn on them by their apprenticeship system, which was pretty good, as the International Apprenticeship Awards show. The other modules were delivered in the ITs. There should be no reason why that can't continue. And indeed, if you look at the replies to the parliamentary, I think it was your question, Deputy Kelleher, if I'm not mistaken, about the range of new apprenticeships that are there. The ITs have have a pretty strong role in many cases, and in some cases, in some ITs, they'll be swapping classes where traditionally you would have had 80 in September and maybe would have dropped to 40 or 30 by the following June. You'll be swapping maybe for a consistent level of 60 right the way through in the block releases. But from the teacher's point of view, you'll probably be dealing with a more mature and engaged class. Sorry, does that answer your question?
Well, just a sort of follow-up would be, I mean, do you to have, you reference recourse, do you have recourse if you're given evidence that an employer, has abused the work permit system to keep wages low within a company? Would you have recourse within the instruments of the state?
We would certainly take it up with the department or, as appropriate, with the WRC.
But you've received no evidence of such behaviour?
No evidence as of yet.
Okay.
No evidence as of yet.
And just for information purposes, the Low Paid Commission now comes under the remit of the Department of Social Protection and Employment. So there's a crossover in a lot of the areas. Senator O'Reilly.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation. There is a suggestion, though, that is being used to depress wages. So is it your contention that, for instance, the meat industry has been mentioned? I mean, at what level of wage do you think it becomes attractive? Because there is a problem with numbers there. I think there's certainly very much a need for this policy. It's a very useful and essential policy instrument in terms of a rapidly changing world and skill sets that are required. If we think about IT and pharma and other things where people want to expand, opportunity comes quickly, we don't have them. You talk about, do we make them, or do we rent them, or hire them, bring them in, or do we create our own? I think we have to do both. But it takes so long to create our own in terms of a training course. If we gear up, it's going to take a few years, and the need is immediate. So I think we have to do both. I'd hope you'd agree with that. I think policing, just in the context of the last question, policing the system is important to make sure that there isn't abuses. And I mean, I hear what you say, that there isn't any direct evidence, but whispers in the background. But certainly, I'm relieved to hear that the earlier comments you made, you answered my question about the language and accommodation, is part of the package. It's not deducted from the wages, which would have been something that would have happened maybe years ago. And just a few comments then and around apprenticeships, which I'm hugely supportive of. I think it suits a lot of people. You mentioned about the lack of supervision. You're suddenly on your own when you go to college, and that's particularly true for, maybe not so much now, but it was years ago when people went to boarding school where they were under total supervision and then suddenly found themselves with all this freedom. They very often ran into trouble. But there's also the other more serious situation that even though we have free education, the cost of accommodation, the cost of supporting yourself is a real challenge. And if you're one of a number in a family, that can be prohibitive. So earn as you learn is certainly something that I'd be hugely supportive of. And I agree with you too about the comment made by the employer about selling it to the mothers of Ireland, because there is a bit of intellectual snobbery goes on. And yet, I was mentioning to the committee, we were in Germany at the Sparkassen Bank, and they have their own set up now where they educate bankers, and it is an earn as you learn program, so that you're making a wage but you're also learning about banking. And it's good because it's instilling a particular ethos into them around, community, and look at the business, look at the person. Don't be just looking at the opportunity to make a commission, which is, I think, what got us into so much trouble in the past in this country in terms of banking. So would it be fair to say that you're broadly supportive of the apprenticeship programme, and how would you improve it from your point of view, other than obviously trying to expand the areas that are covered currently to allow for a bit of overlap?
Okay, in terms of the apprenticeship programme, we do support it, we fully support it. I think the most positive thing we could say at the moment that in relation to the new apprenticeships, which are experimental, they should be given chance to develop. Some of them may falter, and if they do, it's not anyone's fault. because if you don't experiment, you'll never develop anything new. So, but I mean, some of the new apprenticeships are very prosperous and are doing very well. In relation to the pressure, I don't think there's a cabal of employers getting into a room and conspiring to depress wages. But the fact of the matter is, and it's not us that's saying, it's the DSEAP saying, where employees on work permits are working for relatively low rates of pay, this will tend to set rates and conditions for other workers in the same occupations and sectors. Full stop. That's a weight that drags upon the sectoral conditions. And some of the complaints I've heard, incidentally, are not from Irish citizens. They're the bitter complaints I've heard at union meetings from Polish citizens, Lithuanian citizens, who are complaining about the pressure of non-EEA workers. And that brings me to another point. I think in terms of foreign-born population, for want of a better word, Ireland has one of the highest percentages in the EU. So we have been hugely opening to migrants in our labour market since 2004. We were one of the 3 countries that opened up fully to the EU 10 as it was. So this is not a problem. People from foreign countries coming into work is not a problem. It's people from foreign countries coming into work who will be told, you have a particular type of permit, your stay in the state is conditional, and if you rock the boat you could find yourself back where you came from. And I go back to the ship and to the Romanians waving the €50 notes in the 6 o'clock news, and to the Ukrainians say, look, we'll stick on the ship. That's the fundamental point. Have I answered? I think I've covered most.
I mean, 1 in 5 people in Dublin, from memory of the last census I saw, are not Irish. I mean, are not native Irish. And I absolutely agree with your contention that people have to be allowed room to make mistakes, or they're not going to innovate. And I mean, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So I did indicate at the outset, Chair, that I would have to leave before 5.
You did. Thank you very much, Senator Riley. Deputy Kelleher.
Thank you. Just a few issues, and maybe some of the questions might be slightly repetitive, but I just would like to get my own take on it. In terms of apprenticeships, and predominantly in the traditional areas of the wet trades and the electrical area as well, primarily, I'm always of the view that there has to be pathways out of those trades as well, in terms of the traditional areas of men up in scaffolding at 55 to 60 years of age. I don't think it's an attractive outcome for any young person to make a decision as a career choice if there's no further enhancement and development of the skill sets to move them away from the physical aspect of that at later stages. And I suppose you see that quite evident in the construction industry, particularly when you have a downturn in an economy where you have a lot of people, particularly men, physically beaten up after a tough time on the sites. And other than the trade that they actually have no other skill set at all. And I said that's primarily in the wet trades, but it is in other areas as well, in agriculture as well, where it takes a heavy toll on the body. And I'm just wondering if we are to enhance and expand our capacity in terms of infrastructural development, housing, roads, sewers, childcare facilities, and all the rest. Engineers are one thing, they're quite mobile. If you have a skills shortage, you may be able to bring people from outside in. But in terms of our own indigenous population and those that come from outside in the apprenticeship areas, where would you see us being able to advance and enhance the apprenticeship courses to allow for people to continue some form of training as the years progress? And where would you see them being able to fit into the construction industry, but per se not on the scaffolding or actually on the building site? If you understand my concept here.
I understand it very well, Deputy. Yes, sorry.
The other issue then, of course, is, and I suppose this leads me on to the question that was raised previously, the issue of a pathway and a gateway to degree courses and further development into academia, masters, etc., for some people who may want to take that pathway but aren't ready at a younger age to do that. And I just think that there's a very sort of them enough situation. You go for an apprenticeship course in the traditional sense and you go off down one route, or else you go into third level and you never meet again. Yeah. Whereas if you look at Germany and elsewhere, there's quite a symbiotic crossover of apprenticeships and academia, or third level facilities and things like that. I'm just thinking, can we be more creative, imaginative in that area? So, for example, an apprenticeship course might take you to a level 6, then to a movement to a level 8, and then into degree courses and continue on. That would be just one area. In terms of the apprenticeships themselves, and I suppose while the state has been involved in terms of overseeing of apprenticeships, traditionally through FÁS and now through Solace, is there a greater role for, we'll say, for example, the public sector itself to provide apprenticeships? Multinationals, for example, of all shapes and colours, the financial services sector, for example. Are we creative and imaginative enough in giving either incentivisation or stick to these entities to create more apprenticeship places? And I just think that maybe that's an area where people may not always have the skill set to go directly into a third level, and we'll say into a financial institution. But if they had an opportunity to go in and under an apprenticeship scheme, they could develop the skills as in the system itself. And I'm just thinking, do we, or are we creative, imaginative enough in that? On the issue of work permits, and I suppose traditionally, if you're a free marketeer or a capitalist, the theory is that if there's a shortage of labour, the price of labour goes up and people flow into that particular sector. Of course, it doesn't happen like that, particularly in the lower skilled areas, agriculture, in parts of construction, horticulture and the hospitality sector as well, there's no doubt. And I'm just wondering, with the cost of accommodation in this country, is there a potential for a lot of exploitation? In view of the fact that, let's be honest, you could be working 40 hours a week on €10 an hour, but if your accommodation charges are excessive by the employer, well, then it could have a major impact on that person. And I'm just wondering, is there any evidence in that area that that's beginning to happen? And I can remember in a previous life, I was once a Minister for State, we were established NERA, Great NERA, which was vilified, being honest, but at the same time, some of the stuff that began to unearth in the previous boom in this country, in hotels, the farming sector, the fishing sector as well, where accommodation was used as almost the prison, because they could not afford to go anywhere else. And I'm just wondering, is that beginning to creep into the system again? So they're my questions.
Okay. Pathways. I bring you back to one of the apprenticeships I mentioned, which speaks to two things, which speaks to pathways and speaks to a shortage of engineers, and it's the LIT, the electrical apprenticeship in Limerick Institute of Technology, which you can only get into if you're an electrician, because the best way to build level 7 engineers is to take level 6 electricians and train them up, mainly at the weekend. Purely anecdotally, a lot of multinationals come in and they have the money to do it, and they'll just hire engineers by the 100. And then they will allocate them tasks which you don't need an engineer to do. And you'll have young engineers saying, look, I'm finding it difficult to get CPD points. I'm doing compliance, QA, I'm ticking boxes. This is not real engineering, where in fact you'd probably be better off doing compliance and QA with somebody who's been a bit of time in the industry and is acute and knows the scams people get up to try and get around QA tick boxing, which we all do if we were to be honest with ourselves. So there is the issue of there's a global shortage of engineers. Multinationals come in and they have the money to hire them by the gross. So therefore there must be other ways number one, other ways to build them, and number two, some way to have a discussion with multinationals. Say, do you really need engineers for all these tasks? I know the Institute of Engineers, or Engineers Ireland, sorry, as they call themselves, have an associate at technician level, which gives a pathway towards engineering and towards chartered engineer. If you work permits, one of the interesting things that occurred in the most latest interdepartmental group is that the Department of Housing were involved. which they wouldn't have been in the previous boom, and the Department of Housing, where their attitude was, why are you bringing in people to do work for whom there are people here who are already in houses? And this is one of the things this time around about bringing people in from outside the country to do anything, is how much more difficult will it mean for existing workers to get accommodation, to pay for accommodation, or to be condemned for 4 hours of commuting every day. So, I mean, all these things are linked together. Traditionally, if we go back to the 19th century, employers built houses. You know, Guinness built houses for their employees. Many mills built houses for the employees. The railway companies built houses for the employees.
Employers built houses.
Huh?
Good employers built houses.
Yeah. But maybe it may come back to that. And I know indeed some employers have taken leaseholds on small blocks of accommodation, so that if they have people coming in mainly from the EU 28, they can say, well, look, you can settle in there for a month and get yourself sorted out. But in Dublin now, even a month won't get yourself sorted out with anything affordable. Sorry, there's one other thing I want to draw your attention to, is the role of people who come in on English language learning visas. Now, this has worked very well and has supported the industry, and the industry has to a great extent been cleaned up. And we see less, thanks be to God, of schools closing up and taking the fees. There is a proposal, a bill in the Shannon, I think, for a new legislation in this area. And from what we have seen, it could represent a fairly regressive step, is that as opposed to mandatory insurance before you move, that there will be a sinking fund, a thing like the Motor Insurance Bureau of Ireland. There's a danger here that we're going back towards the old thing of light touch regulation. And certainly, I'm very conscious of lobbying, because I'm the one that does the lobbying returns for the ICTU, and giving you advance warning to some of you and your colleagues that we will probably be lobbying about the precise format of that bill and what it proposes, because we think it's a step backwards.
That bill
Just on the wet trades and the construction trades, apprenticeships, what do we do as people get older and we haven't been good at that?
Yeah, traditionally there were a range of jobs in building, not enough of them, but there were a range of jobs for progression. For example, there was the old general foreman on the site, who tended always to be a carpenter, because bricklayers are in at a certain stage, painters in at another stage, carpenters are always around, so they tended to know the game. There were clerks of works. They, as a sort of a body, have almost disappeared. So maybe there needs, and one of the things that apprenticeship allows, though it hasn't been fully developed, is the provision for development of lifelong learning. And maybe employers, and I mean, I don't want to give employers a bad reputation, because an awful lot of employers want to do the right thing by their workforce. And employers often say that the 20-somethings we get are they're of limited use to us. They come in like, whereas maybe they should be looking and saying, well, maybe what about the 40-somethings? Is there something we could do for them by doing a block release and an upskilling course, because they know the industry? But I know certainly myself, in a previous role in the organisation, we were running a health and safety training, and in September I was collecting the fees, and I went out to the Red Cow Lewis construction site and took a wad of money off a dumper driver who said, this is a young man's game, I want to get into health and safety, and that to me says it all. And if we want to build careers in construction as opposed to jobs in construction, that's the way forward. But there is that middle bit of the pyramids which seems to have been hollowed out, like the clerk of works, like the general foreman, and maybe it's the lengthening change of subcontracting. I don't know, but it's something we certainly have to have a look at.
And just finally, in that context, inspection, would there be any role for people who had been previously the ones putting the blocks up, now inspecting somebody putting the blocks up, or, compliance in building probably was something that we were weak at for a number of, is there a role there?
But I mean, I think you would have asked, or your colleagues, and all of your colleagues would have asked some questions about the unfortunate bit of bother we've gotten ourselves into over 42 schools. Is we seem to have downplayed the role of inspection, and gone down this road of light touch regulation, which served us so well in the financial sector. And for that to happen, there has to be a will for the Oireachtas to say we need to look at building inspection. We need to look at what has gone wrong. And again, I go back to the fishing thing. What has gone wrong, and what is the evidence, and how do we avoid it?
I think the point Deputy Kelleher is trying to make, though, obviously somebody who's a brickie or a blocklayer for 30 years, they can do it until they're 50, but you'd be hoping that they could take on another role, maybe of inspection, that they may be able to move on.
And that requires a specific intervention, because what's learnable, you know, there's an awful lot of things if you go to third level that you bring your life experience to. But for example, mathematics is not one of them. In fact, it's probably more difficult to learn mathematics at my age, and I'm in my 60s, than it is when I was 16. You know, and these things have to be worked at, because if you're doing inspection and construction, there's certain things that you need to know about, well, the laws of physics, for example, and how stuff falls down.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Neville?
Yeah, just quickly in relation to that, just following on to that point, has there been any, are you aware of any discussions, or have you been privy to any discussions with the Construction Industry Federation and the Department around broadening career prospects for people who would now be looking to move into the construction sector? I've read some bits and pieces about it in the media here and there in magazines or Construction Industry Federation magazines, but has there been any discussions, or are you aware of any discussions on that side?
The fact that I'm not aware of them doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Construction's not part of my brief. A colleague deals with that. My apologies.
Right, yeah, okay.
Senator Humphreys, to conclude?
Yeah, I think you brought up some interesting points. Actually, I was employed by a progressive employer that was into lifelong learning, that actually worked with the trade union movement to develop training courses for people as they move through their career and as their career has changed. And one of the things I always remember, in the height of the last boom, we had quite a number of construction workers that moved into the pharmaceutical industry basically with a leaving cert. But when the collapse came, it went from a leaving cert to a degree before you get inside the door for an interview. So the qualification increased. But I think there's a real role, and I think the state has a role to acknowledge the idea of lifelong learning and also career changing. Billy, that you mentioned is people can't stay in the meat industry all their life. They can't stay in the building trades. You know, I think there's a responsibility for the state to provide, you know, an education and an outlet to allow people to change their careers at different stages. We need construction workers, but a blocklayer can't work in his late 50s laying blocks. Just physically not capable of it. But one of the other things, just in relation to the apprenticeships, and I certainly welcome the expansion of the apprenticeship schemes, but, you know, like I've always had the opinion, is plan for the worst and hope for the best. One of the issues that hit the apprenticeship schemes in the last collapse was where people had invested, you know, 3-4 years into the apprenticeship and then weren't able to manage to finish their apprenticeship. So that, you know, so when we're encouraging people into the apprenticeships area, there has to be a commitment to ensure that they will be able to finish that apprenticeship and that they won't be caught, you know, 3-4 years into a cycle and the cycle collapse. And it is so when we're because if you go into a university to do a degree, you're safe enough now the university is going to be there for your 4-year degree or 5-year degree. So the same confidence has to be given to people that wants to participate in apprenticeships, is that they will be able to start and finish even if there's a collapse in the economy during the period. Yet nobody was chucked out of universities, but an awful lot of electricians were chucked out, apprentice electricians were chucked out of their jobs and weren't able to finish. So we need to do a level of work on that. Just in relation to Dr. Certainly, and James Riley mentioned is the whispers in relation to work permits. You know, I work extensively in the inner city, and one of the whispers are obviously going is in relation to the whispers in relation to work permits in relation to the hospitality sector and the abuses that are in there, what I would hear on a regular basis. And then the other one states back is in relation to the meat industry and the pressurised. Now, it's good in one way when we say 22,000. It sounds an awful lot, but it's not for a high demanding skill job and depression. So, like, I would be anxious that work permits in itself are a welcome thing. And you mentioned the stats. I think it's over 15% of our workforce were not born in Ireland. Yet we don't have the same issues that other countries have, and I think that's very welcomed. But we must do a well-managed work permit to make sure we don't go down the avenues that other countries have passed. And there's small things, and it's one I will mention is in relation to the stamp 4 permissions. and the exploitation that's happening there. I was just talking to a young woman that has a stamp 4 permission, and now she needs to renew it, but because of the flaws in the system, all the appointments are booked out, and she has to pay a private company to get an appointment. And we need to move very quickly in relation to closing down those abuses, because that's somebody that wants, and we've been encouraged to come to fill a skills gap, which is now being abused through a gap of our own private sector. So certainly I will be approaching this as obviously is to make sure that it doesn't become a drag in relation to wages, and then people that come in relation to this country in relation to visas are treated well and to a very high standard. And we haven't always been that good in those areas. And you mentioned the work this committee done in relation to the fishery sector, but certainly I certainly wouldn't be holding my head up with pride in how we dealt with some people in the hospitality sector.
Okay, thank you. To conclude, Dr. Rigney, please.
Yeah, I always enjoy talking to a committee at the Oireachtas, because I think most people see the theatre of the main house and the debates, and don't see the work of committees, where people, without prejudice to their individual opinions, manage to progress matters, to scrutinise legislation. And that's why I always, well, apart from being a civic duty both for myself and for Congress, I always enjoy talking to legislators and talking through the issues. We have managed to avoid the racism and xenophobia in other states, but we can't take that for granted, and we have to. The price of that is eternal vigilance. So, Gormahagut.
So I would like to thank you for coming here today to engage with the committee. It was very informative. We do have some more sessions to take, and when we do them, we will be producing a document, and you might like to come back for the launch of that. Gormahagut.
Thank you.
Okay, we're just going to suspend now the meeting for a moment to allow our next guests to take their seats. Is that agreed?
Chair, I'll endeavour to get back.
Thank you very much, Senator. I would like to welcome from the Irish Business and Employers Confederation Mr Tony Donoghue, Head of Education and Social Policy, Ms Una Fitzpatrick, Director Technology Ireland, Ms Sinead Keogh, Director Medtech and Engineering, Ms Claire McGee, IBEX Senior Innovation and Education Executive, and Ms Siobhan Dean, Biopharmachem Ireland Executive, to the second session of our meeting to discuss Ireland's skill needs. In accordance with procedure, I am required to read out the following. By virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. If you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of those proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person or persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I have already read out the one to the members. I would remind our guests that the presentation should be no more than 10 minutes duration. Members have been circulated with the presentation submitted already. I now ask Mr Donoghue to make the presentation to the committee, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the committee for the opportunity to address you on what is a critical issue for employers. Given the strong performance of the Irish economy, high employment demand has given rise to significant skills and labour shortages. I think the policy challenge now is to minimise these shortages by developing a suite of interventions which respond swiftly to emerging and future skills needs. Therefore, I think it's appropriate that you've asked us to address the issue of apprenticeships and the issue of work permits in terms of how they might be used to address skill gaps. I'll ask, with your permission, Chair, my colleagues to come in and bring in some specific insights into some of these issues. They represent sort of different sectors within IBEC, and they have some sort of practical learning there.
Sorry, I just have to interject. If any of you have mobile phones, if you wouldn't mind putting them on silent mode, please, because they do interfere with the microphones, even if they're, or if you could turn them off, please. You could hear it buzzing there a second ago. It just picks them up for some reason. Thank you very much.
Firstly, I want to focus on apprenticeships because they become the subject of significant political attention both in Ireland and internationally. It's over 6 years since IBEC was invited to participate on the then government's review of apprenticeship training in Ireland. At the time, it was felt that the apprenticeship system, which was limited to 26 craft-based occupations, did not reflect the broader skills needs of the economy. The review suggested a new model of business-led apprenticeships that could boost skill levels across the economy and help to get people into sustainable jobs. Companies themselves would be involved in both the design of curricula and in the delivery of the on-the-job element of programmes, some of which could extend up to higher degree level. This would ensure the continuing relevance of qualifications in a rapidly changing labour market. The apprenticeships could also offer a real alternative to ambitious and capable young people who may be looking for alternatives to direct entry from school to higher education and would be interested in an earn and learn model. A lot of hard work has been put into a project to turn this aspiration into a reality. But some of us have been frustrated at the speed at which the new apprenticeships have come on stream. But in retrospect, this probably shouldn't be a surprise. The starting point for any consideration of new apprenticeship models usually includes a reference to well-established dual systems like Austria or Switzerland or Germany. And much of the commentary tends to ignore the fact that Ireland can't simply adopt systems that have been built over generations in some cases upon very different economies, labour markets and social partnership arrangements. We also have to acknowledge the reality that apprenticeships and vocational education in general tend not to enjoy parity of esteem in a society that tends to define educational achievement in terms of CAO points and entry to higher education. That's not to say that we don't have something to learn from other national systems. In fact, the Apprenticeship Review Group tried to distill some of the principles on which they are based to inform a model that could work in an Irish context. And we should remember apprenticeships are a distinct model of education. They're not internships, they're not traineeships. They're a deep and academically accredited learning experience in preparation for a specific occupation. And I actually do believe that the new apprenticeship project, as we call it, is beginning to gain some momentum. The action plan to expand apprenticeships and traineeships 2016 to 2020 sets ambitious but achievable targets for the introduction of 40 new programmes and a cumulative total of 33,000 new apprenticeship registrations by 2020. Almost 20 new programmes in areas such as accountancy, ICT, insurance, international financial services, manufacturing and biopharma have come on stream, and you will have an opportunity to hear in more detail about some of these apprenticeships from my colleagues, hopefully. I now want to turn briefly to the subject of work permits. And again, when we're discussing work permits, it's important to differentiate between labour and skills shortages. Labour shortage refers to a situation in which there is a shortage of individuals willing or available to take up employment opportunities. Skills shortages refers to a situation in which there is a shortage or an insufficient number of trained or qualified individuals in the domestic market to meet the demand. In the main, the Irish employment permit system has, in the past, responded relatively well to labour market shortages and surpluses. The mix of permit types, criteria and duration have served us well over the last number of years, drawing on labour market intelligence from the Expert Group on Future Skills Needs, the Solus Skills and Labour Market Research Unit, the National Skills Council and general employer engagement. This is supported by EU-level analysis, which shows that Ireland leads most EU member states in terms of developing a labour market migration policy that's linked with labour market intelligence, connecting almost all employment permits to identified labour market gaps. However, as we move towards full employment, the ability to enable future growth potential depends on how well we address labour shortages and respond to shifts brought about by changing economic conditions facing different sectors. We welcome some of the recommendations made by the Interdepartmental Review of Economic Migration Policies, such as new measures to attract foreign nationals who have relevant experience in areas such as ICT, but may not have the required academic qualification. The number of employment permits has been increasing in recent years, with over 9,000 permits issued in 2017. The IT and health and welfare sectors combined account for 3/4 of all new permits issued. 9 of the top 20 companies for which employment permits were issued were technology companies, and you'll be hearing about that in a little more detail. The other 11 were healthcare organisations. New permits were primarily issued for professional occupations, with 2/3 of all new permits issued for the Dublin region. As I said earlier, the current system has performed well in general. The highly skilled occupational list is reviewed on a timely basis and engages well with the labour market intelligence available. At an operational level, however, there have been some challenges, particularly in recent months, particularly around transitioning from the critical skills work permit after 2 years to the stamp 4 permission to work. While the Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation provides a letter for the individual after 21 months of employment, there can be problems receiving the stamp, the immigration stamp, in a timely fashion. Greater collaboration between the departments and the Naturalisation and Immigration Service is needed to ensure that after investing in these highly skilled employees, we don't lose this talent due to unnecessarily bureaucratic procedures or a disconnection between government services. Work needs to be done to ensure a cohesive interdepartmental approach to work permits and visas, as delays in this area are becoming a significant issue, not only for day-to-day applications, but also within the Trusted Partner Initiative. My colleague Una from Technology Ireland will be able to provide some practical examples of the issues encountered by her member companies in this regard. So I'll stop there, Chair, and I'd like once again to thank you and colleagues for this opportunity to introduce this subject, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr Donoghue. So we're going to open it to questions, and I might kick off myself. The first thing I wanted to raise, Deputy Kelleher actually brought a motion through the Dáil last week in relation to apprenticeships, and I think it's very timely that we had that motion last week and that we're here now discussing it today. For the first 6 months of this year, we put a lot of effort, this committee, into the cost of doing business. And we had all the stakeholders in from across all the different sectors. But it was interesting to hear from the tourism, the hospitality sectors, agriculture and construction. They all bemoaned the fact that, the lack of apprenticeships coming through. And especially in relation to the tourism and the hospitality sectors, they spoke about dismantling of CERT in 2013, that there hasn't been any single organisation with sole responsibility for hospitality and tourism. And this training policy, the lack of this training policy has left a huge void in that particular industry. Also in relation to, and I'm sure Deputy Kelleher will touch on this later, in relation to construction, we heard a lot about people who would have worked in the construction industry, but when they get to their mid-50s, they find it very hard to continue along those lines, because obviously it's a physical job. And I'd just like your comments on those two issues first. And secondly, I'd like to raise the point that I was actually shocked last week when I heard that women represent only 2% of all those doing apprenticeships in this country at the moment. And for example, 54% of all apprenticeships taken up in the UK between 2016 and 2017 were women. And if you could address why you believe that there are so few women entering into apprenticeships and what we can do to improve those statistics. Thank you. Whoever would like to answer.
Yeah, okay, Chair. I'll make some initial response to that, but I'll ask my colleague, particularly from the medical devices sector and the polymer sector, where they've got some practical experience of new apprenticeships, to address it and maybe to introduce some other issues that we have, because I think, okay, you've got a particular concern over hospitality, but a lot of the issues in developing the apprenticeship model is peculiar to all apprenticeships, to be honest with you. I'll take hospitality first, and I look forward to coming back to this committee at the end of the month, actually, with another hat on. I chair the expert group on future skills needs, and we've been looking at hospitality, and we've heard a lot of what you've heard in terms of the shortages in that particular sector. I think what it's lacked, and it's not the first time we've heard the closure of CERT being moaned by the sector. I think it lacked a lead department to take ownership of that. And the expert group has done analysis of the hospitality sector, and there are new implementation structures being in place, so hopefully they will be able to address that issue. Just on female apprentices, that reflects the traditional structure of the industries in which apprenticeships existed. 80% of apprenticeships were actually in the construction sector, and because of the nature of those trades, they tended to be male-dominated. In fact, since the introduction of new apprenticeships, we've, for example, the insurance apprenticeship, where we've got 100 females, so we've probably got more apprentices on that one particular programme than the entire history of apprenticeship in the state. And I think as you see the profile and the expansion of the model into other sectors, you'll see that gender balance addressed. But maybe you'd like to talk about your own experience.
So certainly, so I'll just introduce myself first, and I'll talk a little bit about our programme, and I'll address some of the questions, Chair, if that's okay. So my name is Sinead Keogh. I represent the medtech and engineering sectors within IBEC. So that includes medical technologies, polymer technologies, and engineered manufacturing goods. So that cohort represent about 80,000 people in Ireland, and what's unique about those companies is there is a significantly large proportion of SMEs. So in 2017, after working for 3 years, we finally launched the 3 apprenticeship programs: manufacturing technician at level 6, manufacturing engineer at level 7, and polymer technology at level 7. So we're delighted to say that over the last number of years, or 2 years, we have recruited in year 1 106 apprentices across 58 companies. That included 2% women. So this year we've gone to 170 apprentices, which with 10% female in the second cohort, and it is something that we are working very closely on and trying to promote more women on our apprenticeship programs. It is it is a priority for our boards to encourage more women into the apprenticeship programs. So first of all, we acknowledge the point you've made, and it is something that we are working towards. So the apprenticeships that we're running are with 5 IoT partners. So we're working with Limerick, we're working with Cork, we're working with Athlone, we're working with Sligo, and we're working with Galway. So and that is a reflection of, I suppose, the industry that we're serving. It is a highly regionalised industry, both engineering, medtech, and polymer technology. So in terms of then the types of recruitment, currently we have 70% of those 170 are within the industry. So they are recruitment within the sector, so they're already working within the companies, and 30% are new hires. So we do expect, though, that to change over the years ahead. We expect more new hires, and as you know, as the industry becomes upskilled. So in terms of issues, I suppose we've been one of the first, I would say, out of the blocks in terms of new apprenticeships. It is important to remember that it is an occupational profile. So the apprenticeship that we're operating is, as you say, it's a manufacturing technician engineer. It is open to all manufacturing sectors. And if you look at the types of companies that have engaged, it is 48% medical technologies and 52% in engineering. So it is quite broad, and it is, I suppose, the occupational profile or the building block for engineering in general. So we are out there promoting it far and wide. This year we have recruited food, ICT, aviation, automotive. So we're recruiting lots of different manufacturing sectors. So just in terms of one of the key areas, I suppose, which we're facing, and one of the challenges around expanding the apprenticeship would be around the cost of getting involved. So for example, for an SME or a company to engage in the apprenticeship, the cost for a 3-year programme for a new hire is about 90,000. It's because our apprenticeship is made up of 15 weeks off-site, and we spent 2 years developing that model. And because it is a hands-on technical training type of apprenticeship, the requirement to be off-site and to be within the IoT is very important to gain those skills. So it is quite different to, let's say, to other different apprenticeships out there, because there is that focus on practical skills. So this, of course, creates a major challenge for a lot of SMEs in terms of cost. So one of the, I suppose, the major barriers for us in terms of growing the apprenticeships would be around the cost for SMEs to engage. So this is something we'd like to, I suppose, raise your attention with. I mean, we've a couple of other issues, but that would be probably the main one at this point.
Okay, thank you very much. Deputy Kelleher?
Presentations. Apprenticeships, I suppose, by and large, they've been historically and traditionally in the construction sector, you say, in the hospitality sector through CERT, and there's now an evolution taking place in the broad Irish labour market in terms of provision of apprenticeships. I suppose the question that you'd have to ask is, why did it take so long for us to accept that there's a need for us to, for industry to get involved in educating its own workforce, and effectively is what an apprenticeship is about. In a way, it's about developing skill sets of employees and for them to progress through not just a company but through a particular employment sector. And in that context, you referenced the fact that particularly Sinead, in the terms of the cost involved. So if it is prohibitive or expensive, to say the very least, to take on an apprenticeship and to develop an apprenticeship course, what can we do to offset that in terms of is it tax reliefs? Is it what would incentivise? Bearing in mind, you say there's 80,000 in your sector. Is it 80,000 employees or 80,000?
So 38,000 in medtech, 37 in engineering, and of course manufacturing is 220,000.
So if you look at the number of apprentices you have in apprenticeship, it's not a huge number vis-a-vis the amount of people working in the industry. So clearly there's a lot to be done, but it's a step, and it's not a criticism, these are just observations, because we're all trying to work our way around to see how we can best advance apprenticeships in this country. But, okay, so the incentives, what do you require? I always believe that, the public sector should play a greater role in providing apprenticeships. You look at the financial banking sector as well. Multinationals, for example, clearly would be ones that you would feel that would have the capacity to deliver apprenticeship courses, and not only the capacity, but equally the incentive to deliver apprenticeship courses for upskilling their employees. Because the idea that we can allow somebody else train the people and you employ them, and when there is a downturn, well, you let them off, or and if there's a skill shortage, you bring them in from abroad. Certainly, that's not a long-term sustainable way of managing a labour market and an economy that is consistently evolving. So that would be just an observation in that context. In the other area of apprentices, and the Chair referred to it, some trades people can evolve, or some apprenticeships or trades, they can evolve and move into other areas. But in certain areas, particularly in the construction industry, in hospitality, for example, in other areas where traditionally there would have been lower pay, it is hard for them to move beyond their traditional apprenticeship role. So a block layer is a block layer until the arthritis sets in and they can no longer lay blocks. Very often the same with people in the hospitality sector as well, below lower management, should we say, just in the basic skill sets areas. They don't move that well through the system. And I'm just wondering, what can we do to make clear pathways into an apprenticeship and clear pathways for career progression? Maybe using that as the apprenticeship as the anchor, but deviating from it either into formal education, training, third-level degrees, and on, or something. So if you could just expand on that, if possible.
Maybe I'll answer the first question around what we can do in terms of incentivising, and then somebody else can take the next. So just in terms of, I suppose we would like to see more SMEs engage in the current apprenticeship. It has been developed for all of the, all of the economies. So we really want to make sure that they're not disincentivised, or that they have, the opportunity to engage. So if you're looking at a salary of €24,000, looking at what the cost is for 15 weeks, it's roughly around 7,500. So we'd be looking for an incentive for 7,500 for SMEs, essentially, to take on an apprentice. And that's not including all of the costs in terms of training that apprentice. So
this is to fund the block release, effectively, is it? What the old traditional block release? Okay.
Yeah, so that's just at a very high level in terms of what our companies have said would make a difference in terms of being able to take on apprenticeships. I mean, for us, they're successful if we can engage both the SME and the FDI community. That's really important for us because we represent both.
Mr. Chair, the pinch point here is the payment for off-the-job training, because under the craft apprenticeships, the off-the-job training costs are actually handled by the state. That's the big difference, and that has been a pinch point, particularly for SMEs. But you made two other points which I'd just like to pick up on. In terms of, you used the example of a block layer. I think there's been acknowledgement within the traditional craft apprenticeships that they didn't focus enough on the what we call the transversal skills, the employability skills, the softer skills, and therefore there were very few opportunities to move out of that. It should be a broader education experience. But I was taken by your point around I think you used the word anchor, the apprenticeship as the anchor, and I would agree 100%. And what characterises the new apprenticeships are the progression opportunities. And I would bring in two colleagues here, because we've got examples where we can provide a pathway into apprenticeships, and then, particularly in the high-tech sector, progression opportunities up through to higher degree level. Not everybody might want to go that far, but at least that progression opportunity should be there. And why that's so critical is if you're competing, as I said in my opening remarks, with the CAO system, those progression opportunities need to be there within the apprenticeship model, and that's the power of the apprenticeship model. And as I say, with your permission, I'll introduce an example of, first of all, progression into apprenticeship, and then progression up to the higher levels, if that's okay.
Maybe I might answer first, and thank you, Deputy Kelleher, for your question. I just wanted to maybe very briefly touch on pre-apprenticeship programmes, because the time is now when we are at kind of a very tight labour market, that we are now looking at how can we get more and more people have that opportunity to participate in an education programme. So very briefly, pre-apprenticeship programmes are generally targeted at young people between 16 and 24 years, where the aim is for them to fully progress onto an apprenticeship. So they're aimed at giving young people the skills and the confidence and the connections, and this is incredibly important, because traditionally, maybe in the craft or the more traditional apprenticeships, people mightn't have had that social network or that capital to actually ask an uncle or a neighbour to participate on one of be trained by them as a master apprenticeship. So this is to give them that opportunity and to that network to do it. So it provides a combination of vocational training, hands-on experience, and an opportunity to maybe sample some skills across a broad spectrum of training programmes. And generally they're targeted at young people who have maybe not been very successful up until that point in making a positive or sustained kind of transition into more vocational training. And this is, I suppose, a tailored programme to offer them that. And I'm very kind of heartened to, I suppose, to see some of the recommendations in the recently published Lawless review of a pathway to apprenticeships. And that aims to increase pre-apprenticeship programmes around the country by about 500 by Q3 of 2019. However, this, I suppose, ambition won't be realised without adequate resources and to enable that kind of transition and that changeover. But what I'd like to do is maybe introduce you to a pilot programme that's currently underway with DIT, because this is one of the first ones within Ireland, and it has not really to date received significant state funding. It's been supported by the JP Morgan Foundation, so a philanthropic fund, and through philanthropic funding through ESB. And in 2017, DIT launched a pilot programme which is aimed at supporting the transition of young people, particularly in the Dublin inner city centre, from areas of socio-economic disadvantage to secure apprenticeships. So thinking about DIT, it has its roots in vocational education. Traditionally, they supplied about 75 or 25% of the traditional apprenticeships. So this was about addressing kind of the lack of knowledge for young people in these areas to secure an apprenticeship, as well as those low levels of social capital that I mentioned, and generally targeting areas within the inner city Dublin. It was rolled out over an 18-month period, and over that 48 students were recruited on 3 separate 12-week programmes. The 12-week programmes focused on an offer of offering various different skills and opportunities to learn about different types of apprenticeships, and ultimately to build links with employers so that they could see, I suppose, the output of these programmes. Worked access to apprenticeship is what it's known as, and it worked in partnership with employers to provide 2-week work placement at the end of the 12-week programme. And over 50% of the cases, apprenticeships managed to kind of fulfil that workplace programme. The 2-week took place at the end, and it gave a really good insight into, I suppose, a workplace environment and experience of what the reality of an apprenticeship would actually be like for these young people. And it gives them an opportunity to determine, is this a pathway for me? So DIT reached into their network of apprenticeship employers, and they developed, I suppose, a kind of faceted work experience approach where they had an opportunity to work with CISC, they had an opportunity to work with one of their aviation technology companies, they had an opportunity to work with ESB. The programme was also supported by an advisory board, and this is given with key representative groups from including IBEC, the HEA, TIA, the regional, Dublin Regional Skills Forum, CIF and the National Youth Council. So everyone giving their different perspective from, I suppose, from their experience of either young people, their experience of education provision and their experience of employment. After the initial pilot programme, 48 young people moved into, out of the 48 young people, 26 moved into full-time apprenticeships. So I think for a pilot scheme, it has demonstrated in an 18-month period, I suppose, the power that a pre-apprenticeship programme and the transformational effect that it can have. DIT is now working on a second stage pilot programme, again funded by JP Morgan, and this time has managed to secure some HEA funding, so some state funding via the HEA, and this will hopefully aim to develop the programme and work on a couple of, I suppose, tweaks to refine it, built on, I suppose, how it evolved over phase 1. And it would run from October 2018 to March 21. But I just want to make maybe, how can we really support this to bed into our system? And given the fact that this programme was seen as a Level 6 Special Purpose Award, it was not fully recognised by the Department of Social Protection as a qualifying programme for trainee allowance. So this could potentially be a red line issue in the future because the participants were not able to maintain a social welfare payment. So as a result, for the 12-week programmes, they forego that, and they risked losing their payments upon taking up a course, and that fundamentally will be a stumbling block for rolling this out into achieving that 500 number by Q3. So was
it just level 6 they couldn't?
Yeah, it's not recognised as a training programme, so because it's not on the national qualification framework, it's a special purpose award. So if we can kind of maybe do a little bit of work around getting that recognition for it, it then fulfills the Department of Social Protection's, I suppose, requirements to be able to manage a back-to-work allowance or retain or receive a social welfare payment. Because it's critical if we're thinking about the cohort who are going to be involved in it. But also this was very much focused on a pilot scheme within Dublin City Centre, within DIT. And again, what we need to now see for it to be successful is a mainstreaming across the system. So a programme like this could easily work in Limerick, Cork and Galway, where there are equal kind of socio-economic issues that need to be addressed and have particular challenges in there, or there's particular regional employers who need specific skills. So how can we look at maybe rolling this out on a more national basis and get more education and training providers to get involved in that? Just picking up on the point about female participations, there was actually 2 ladies who participated in this programme. They both happen to be sisters, and one has managed to progress on to a full-time apprenticeship. One was 20 and the other one was 16, so she was just slightly too young to take on the full programme. But nonetheless, they're using them front and centre of their campaign to showcase that this is a very good avenue for females to consider if they want to consider apprenticeships in the future.
Do you mind sharing what type of apprenticeships they went on to?
I can do that afterwards, if that's okay. Yeah. I don't have that fully because of different reasons where exactly which companies they went into, but it was across different types of the more traditional apprenticeships in terms of, I don't know where that one female actually went, but I will follow up with you and I can come back to you on that one. A greater emphasis on how employers can actually get involved in the pre-apprenticeship programme to provide that 2-week work placement, and how can we kind of manage that so that the employer actually also receives some benefit out of this in terms of that they can give a structured work experience programme so that they have maybe a particular project that they could get the young apprentices, pre-apprentice to work on. And then ultimately as well, focusing on the cohort, can we include more of the transversal skills, those employability skills that will help them not only with their own emotional and behavioural I suppose, intelligence, but actually help them then to retain on the course and actually improve their own personal outcomes. So it's actually about supporting them while they kind of stick with that programme. And then finally, just to make sure that we can have a greater focus on how this is part of that suite of apprenticeships, so that we can seek appropriate kind of pathways into the new apprenticeship programme. Again, this is a pilot very much focused on DIT's experience within the more traditional construction-based apprenticeship, but how can we see this rolling out into the newer spaces, into some of the new generation apprenticeship that we've just spoken about. Thank you.
Okay. Senator McLaughlin.
Thanks very much for your presentations. Mr Donoghue, in your presentation, you referenced the government's review of the apprenticeship training in Ireland, and you expressed frustration on behalf of some at the speed at which it happened. And I see then you reference comparisons with other countries, and that isn't particularly pertinent because of the cultural changes that need to happen here. But you are frustrated, or some were frustrated at the speed. Who are you frustrated with? Where are the blockages? Where are the problems?
Well, I'll call on a colleague to give you some of the practical insights of this, but from my own perspective, well, first of all, that point around other countries. I mean, the German system was literally developed over centuries. I mean, it's embedded in the way employers do their business, and the involvement of trade unions, the learners in social partnership arrangements. In direct answer to your question, I think it's because there are so many...
Interject again. We have interference again on the microphones, and that's the third time I'm after being told, so I am really sorry. But even if maybe if you put him down on the floor or something, I don't know why today it's so sensitive.
Mine's off.
Yeah.
Airplane mode here too.
Mine's totally switched off.
Yeah, I listen, I'm only passing on the message,
okay.
But I can hear the interference myself,
Yeah.
And you see, for anybody who wants to watch,
Gremlins.
they can't. Okay, continue, Mr Donoghue, please.
Okay. I think it's the number of actors. If you look at, first of all, it was a step change. It was a different way of approaching this, and it was quite. I think the model is still right, and I think the model of sort of enterprise-led apprenticeships is the right one. But if you look at the number of actors involved, you've got SOLAS, you've got the Higher Education Authority, you've got the Department of Education and Skills, you've got Qualifications and Quality Assurance Ireland. So you've got four arms of the state. Then you've got, and this isn't to criticise the state, then you've got multiple companies, sometimes, in fact, in the IBEC ones it's been relatively straightforward because there have been single sectoral groups. There's only one prime group for the medtech and engineering sector, or Technology Ireland, or Pharmachem, but others you've got multiple groups who are trying to come together. So there's a lot of actors there, and I think that by definition slowed it down. And if you look at the apprenticeship plan, it's a 12-stage process. We're using 40-year-old legislation here. Now, a lot of the legislation is still fit for purpose in terms of protection of the apprenticeship and employing somebody on a contract of apprenticeship. We wouldn't actually change a word of that. We think it's fine in terms of the rights and responsibilities of both employers and apprentices. But in terms of approval of companies, designations of sectors, I just think the legislation is probably out of date, and we need to streamline that process. And I think because the way it's presented in the apprenticeship plan, it's a circle of 12 steps, but it's actually more like snakes and ladders in the sense that if you get to a point, you can go back. If you don't get approval, for example, under Qualifications and Quality Assurance Ireland, you've got to go back to the drawing board. Now, I've got no issue about the involvement of the quality assurance agencies, because if this is to mean anything, it needs to be something that employers and learners are confident in the quality of. But I think that our processes are probably still a bit bureaucratic, but I think it's getting better, and I'd like to introduce, if you don't mind, Siobhan in, because she's literally just launched some apprenticeships last week. I think the Minister launched them, and she's probably got through the process a bit quicker than some of the others who are early adopters. So we're probably getting better at that. But just to summarise there's a multiplicity of actors, and we're using old legislation. And you know yourself, it's really difficult to change legislation, because that would be, take quite a while. But I don't know if you want to give a practical example.
Thanks. I suppose we've been quite lucky where we came in the process. We were able to take the learnings from our colleagues within IBIC, within the med tech sector. We launched our programme just last week. It's the higher certificate in science, a level 6 lab technician, and the ordinary bachelor of science degree level 7 analytical scientist. So it's quite unique to our sector, and in this, like the scientists normally work in our sector, they're 100% of the staff will have a third level qualification. So it's quite unique to our industry. So it's a key point that it was industry-led. The need came from the expert group, the report from the expert group on future skills needs in 2016. So, like we say, we came fast to the market, but still we're 2 years in the progress of. By the time we got industry together, we looked at our needs, and then to go for approval, get funding, and then the whole process when you go on to that 12 steps to get your programme launched. So we have been very successful in turning around that within 9 months once we got approval. But and I think it is a balancing act of trying to get up, and that snakes and ladders, as Tony has mentioned. Quality is the utmost importance in this. The ability to progress as well is a very important progress onto the level 8s and level 9s within our sector. And the other key thing that made this very successful as well is that it's not just developed only for the biopharma. It is also going to span out hopefully into the food and the medtech diagnostic side of the medtech sectors as well. Going back to a point earlier that I would like to highlight as well, when we're looking at the representation of women within our programme, the programme that we launched now, it is very new. So our first class was started in October, and we're looking to increase those numbers from a first class of 16. We're looking at this time next year that we're hopefully bringing those numbers up to 100. But when you're looking at the ratios of women in this programme, 64% of that programme were women. So I think we will support that quite well. As I say, progression is very important for the sector as well, and the ability of those people to progress into further programmes after they come off the apprenticeship.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I appreciate today you're asked to give a 10-minute presentation, so you're summarising a lot of points, but I think it would be really helpful to develop this issue of the speed at which change is happening, and I think it would be very helpful for the committee if you were to follow up with a detailed submission on the legislative change that's required, on the blockages that you're encountering in the system. It would be very helpful for us as legislators to be able to practically try to make some changes. In terms of the final question I have, towards the end of your presentation, Mr. Donoghue, you brought attention to this issue of greater collaboration between the department and GNIB, INAS. Have you made representation to the departments in relation to this, and what have they said? What has been their responses?
With your permission, Deputy, I'll take in Una on this one, because she's had a lot of interaction with the department on the whole issue of work permits, because it's a particular issue for the technology sector. As I pointed out in the introduction, most companies are in the tech sector, and they're competing on a worldwide stage for talent. So, Una.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So, as up until recently, the system had been, still somewhat bureaucratic, but working well. Up until the last 6 months, tech companies who are trusted partners, so be that an EI or IDA member client, were assured that a work permit application would usually be approved or not approved, but they'd have an answer within 2 weeks. And at that point then, the employment permit, they can go on to obtain a visa, and that process takes 9 weeks. So your best case scenario was 10 to 11 weeks, and even at that, wasn't great, but we could kind of live with it, and business likes certainty, so if you have certainty around those sorts of dates, you can work to those. However, over the last couple of months, the feedback from companies has been that we've seen that even the processing time for trusted partners has slipped to 8 to 12 weeks. Now, I know there was an update on the DB&I website yesterday regarding processing times, apologising for the delays and advising they had received a high number of applications, and that the current waiting times were 5 weeks for trusted partners and 14 weeks for standard applications. I suppose the feedback we have from our own member companies is it's still significantly higher than that, and the consequences for these delays, I suppose, are that job offers are falling through. There's significant costs being incurred by companies, and this is both multinational companies and indigenous Irish software technology companies. Companies are, using a lot of third-party companies to process applications, increasing costs. And I suppose the feedback then to their own corporate HQs is, particularly negative around this, because they're kind of saying, why can't this happen? Why is this not happening at the moment? So we have been in touch with the department, I suppose, through the Tech Life Ireland review, which is, I suppose, a process around looking at attracting people into Ireland, specifically for the tech sector. The feedback was that just something happened in the department. We never really got to the bottom of what it was, but that they were working to resolve it. I suppose the fact that this has occurred kind of over the last 6 months has led to a number of concerns by companies. Firstly, okay, we want it obviously amended, but will this happen again? And ultimately, I suppose that begins a whole debate then about why Ireland. So it's led to a lot of questions being pushed back, and we've one company down in Cork where they couldn't hire one key figure, and that led to 200 jobs then being moved to Prague. So really, really kind of impactful case studies like that, where I suppose making that point where, it might only seem like one hire or one application, but it has massive ramifications in terms of industry, because that person could be leading an entire team, and that team will go with that person. So I suppose, in terms of our ask, it's that, there's an immediate fix to the current problem, but that perhaps in terms of having the two departments, Department of Business and then Department of Justice, in terms of work permits and visas, it does seem to be a highly bureaucratic system. And I suppose the recommendation from members is that, there's the EU blue card system, and there seems to be other systems throughout Europe that are far more efficient and attractive for companies. So, on a competitive basis alone, it would be worth investigating.
Chairperson, I just would ask Mrs. Fosrick, I thought that was very helpful, to say the least, and particularly alarming in the case of the lost jobs and lost opportunities, that maybe you would do a supplementary submission about the specific problems that you've had, and I think it would be in order, Chairperson, with your agreement, for our committee to then make representations to the departments about this specific issue, because I don't think it can wait for us to conclude our deliberations and recommendations. But if that's in order, Chairperson, I would make that suggestion.
Okay, thank you. And can I just check, is it specific to non-EU workers?
Yes, non-EU. Obviously, the first port of call and the preference of all our companies is hire, Irish or EU nationals, because the paperwork alone is just so much simpler. But in certain cases and in certain highly skilled roles, we have to go further afield.
And you said you only noticed this issue within the last 6 months. Up to
the last 6 months,
okay.
It was fine, and so just something seems to have happened. And so the feedback, we got a presentation from an official within the department to say they acknowledge that there was problems and they're working to fix them, but it's going to take some time.
Yeah, well, the department will be in with us on the 27th, so so we can raise it with them. So did you get that note to us very fast?
Sorry, could I
Deputy
just ask
Kelleher?
one just on the same issue?
Yep.
Is that country? Have you noticed whether that's country specific, or is it everyone outside of the 27?
Well, it's everyone outside the 27. We're having particular issues, with people coming in from the US, people coming in from...
That's where I've noticed it is in relation to the US.
But it hasn't even been discriminatory. We've just had major issues everywhere. Anywhere that's non-EEA nationals, everyone's, like, the companies are jumping up and down, and there's kind of, I suppose they're being asked from their corporate HQs, what's going on?
Yeah, I had 5 queries over the last 4 weeks, and it was Pacific team leaders for US. Yeah. And it's just curious, was it just purely a problem clicked with the US? Because that was all the queries were US related.
A recent change, which we're not entirely sure where it came from because there was no consultation on it, was around re-entry visas. So this is where people send off their passport for a 90-day re-entry visa. It now has to be, you used to be able to just go in person and sort it out. It now has to be posted in.
Is that where the appointments have caused the problem?
Well, all I know is that this now has to be done by registered post. So somebody has to post in their passport, and it's taking 8 weeks to turn around. And these tend to be very senior people who obviously have major time commitment and travel issues. So
when all the work is in order, it's taken 8 weeks to turn around.
Without their passport?
Without the passport. They have to give up their passport for 8 weeks in order for this to be processed, which, nobody wants to give up their passport for 8 weeks, let alone somebody who's very senior within an organisation.
And this is, do you think it has anything to do with Brexit? Do you know the fact that they're getting pedantic now at this stage in relation to different...
I don't really know. To be honest with you, we didn't know, was there a change of policy? I suppose that was the concern. Was this just a processing issue and personnel changes within the department, or had there been a policy shift in terms of the granting of work permits and visas? I suppose the feedback was that it was due to the housing crisis and, in terms of if you hire people, where are they going to live? Sometimes that was the question being proposed.
I'm just wondering, are they after putting extra checks and balances and layers in place on the off chance that there would be a hard Brexit and that they're getting their ducks in a row? Maybe I don't know. It's just something that.
Sure, there's an issue. Kind of. Well, I have a particular geographical issue in relation with what's been said to me as well as they're not making the application now because they want to go home for Christmas. And there's no guarantee they'll get the passport back in 8 weeks, and I've commitment to go back to New York or San Francisco or whatever, so they're not going to surrender the passport for 8 weeks and then come back in and then apply, and it'll be out a day.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Deputy Kelleher, you want to come in there, please?
Very briefly, it's just reference actually to Brexit, work permits, mutual recognition, etc. Obviously, there is a template for an agreement being discussed between the European Union and the UK. And in that context, Ireland will be in a quite unique position. We will still have and be members of the common travel area with the UK. So we will actually, as citizens, have access to the UK labour market. And equally, the UK labour market will have access to Irish citizens in the Republic. And Irish citizens would have access to the European Union labour market, and the European Union would have access to the Republic of Ireland labour market. So in all of that, the country that is most likely to be affected in terms of a draw of labour is the Republic of Ireland itself. In the sense that if you had a very strong growth in the UK, well then you could potentially have a lot of Irish people moving to the UK because European labour would no longer have access to the UK, but the Republic of Ireland would in the common travel area. And I'm just wondering, equally the opposite is the case. Well, that if the European Union weakens and the Republic of Ireland is, has a strong economy, you could have a movement of people either from the UK and or Europe, okay? Because we'll be in the unique position of having access to both labour markets. And with that in mind, have we looked at the issue of the continued convergence of mutual recognition between the UK and Ireland post-Brexit, regardless of what Brexit takes place, be it soft Brexit, medium Brexit or hard Brexit? Particularly, it would be important that any apprenticeships and any courses of all forms right across, that there would be continual mutual recognition with the UK. And that would obviously have profound implications in the context of Northern Ireland and the border counties as well. But I'm just saying, has anybody looked at that? I know it's very difficult to gaze into something that's quite opaque, but at the same time could become crystal clear very quickly, and it could be too late for us if we don't have that detail of certainty around mutual recognition. And the reason I say that is the European Union will obviously be negotiating with the UK. It could be negotiating in the sense that, of the larger issues. But in terms of mutual recognition between Ireland and UK, I think that would be an issue of significant and importance, and particularly if we are developing apprenticeship courses outside of the traditional ones which have been recognised anyway.
There is quite good alignment. Ireland was one of the first countries to have a national framework of qualifications, and we've got a robust and well recognised one. There has, it is aligned with the UK. There's a read across on the different levels. Now they call a level 6 a level 5. They've got a smaller number. We've got 10. They've got 8. But there has been a lot of work done on alignment. And ironically enough, when a lot of this work was done was during the last boom. You're right. That's on me. During the last boom, because we were getting a lot of labour coming in at the time, and what was then the National Qualifications Agency had done a huge amount of work there. So their websites, which they were eventually became Qualifications and Quality Assurance Ireland, QQI, and they have actually done a huge amount of work and read across on different types of frameworks. But I think your general point's an interesting one, because one of the first responses to Brexit was actually in higher education, and a lot of the universities started getting inquiries from British-based academics, and these weren't just Irish people working in UK higher education institutions. It was just that a lot of academics there were just, something like Brexit goes against their core. There is nothing more international than higher education. So there was a lot of unprompted inquiries to education institutions here. I think it could work both ways, you're right, but I think we see it as an opportunity as well, and not just in higher education, but in areas like financial services, etc.
Are you saying so that the convergence and the mutual recognition is primarily just done on a bilateral basis between the Republic of Ireland and the UK, or is there an obligation because of the fact that there was an overarching sort of EU influence there?
Both.
Or is it
both? There's what's called the Bologna process, which looks at aligning frameworks of quality. We were so far ahead of the curve on this, and as was Scotland. England and Scotland are slightly different on this. So it's happening at an EU level, but it had been happening anyway on a bilateral level. And people like City and Guilds are very active in the Republic, for example. So there's been, and you've got a lot of the professional bodies, like the accountancy bodies. These would be engineering. These would be international qualifications, which are actually aligned across international professions. So without being complacent about it, I'd be relatively optimistic that we do have our ducks in a row on that.
Further questions? Okay, so I'd like to thank you for coming here today. It was very, very informative, and thank you for your individual stories. It makes it, it just makes it way more informative when you get real life examples. That concludes all of our business on today's agenda. The Joint Committee is now adjourned until Tuesday the 27th at 4 p.m. Gormaghwood.